The gallery event had wrapped by 9, leaving me with $200 and the distinct ache of someone who'd been on her feet for 8 hours straight while carrying what felt like a boulder in her midsection. I stuffed the check in my jacket pocket, already calculating that covered part of next week's groceries, maybe a quarter of what I'd need for a tank of gas and the prenatal appointment on Thursday. The freelance work had dried up considerably since the bump became undeniable. Clients who'd been eager for my editorial eye 6 months ago suddenly went quiet when I arrived at shoots, with a body that screamed complications they didn't want to handle. The drive back to my apartment took me through downtown Boston, past the neighborhoods where people's problems were the kind money could solve. I'd grown accustomed to this particular flavor of poverty, not the kind that made headlines, but the grinding, relentless kind where you counted quarters in the checkout line and rehearsed conversations with your landlord about late rent. My apartment was a studio in a part of town where the buildings held their secrets close, and nobody asked questions about a woman living alone at 8 months pregnant. The anonymity suited me. I'd been careful about everything. The prenatal clinic was public, staffed with overworked professionals who treated pregnancy like a production line. The ultrasounds happened in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner, and the technician who'd confirmed the baby's sex hadn't asked about the father. I preferred it that way. There were no photographs on my walls. No evidence of a life before this. No connections that could be yanked away or questioned. I'd built this isolation brick by brick, and while it was suffocating, it was also survivable. My mother called twice a week. Margaret worked as a nurse at Boston Medical, the kind of woman who kept antiseptic in her purse and believed that problems yielded to persistent questioning. She knew I'd been involved with someone years ago. Someone complicated. Someone from a world she'd warned me about, with the fervor of a woman who'd raised a daughter alone, and knew exactly how those stories ended. I'd never told her the full scope of what happened, that I'd fallen completely, that he'd asked me to leave everything behind, and when I'd countered with my own request, that he leave behind the darkness he inhabited. We'd both realized we were asking for the impossible. I kept her at a distance now, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. If she knew about the pregnancy, she would arrive at my door with concerns and solutions, and the kind of maternal instinct that would crack the careful walls I'd constructed. She would want to help, to be involved, to know every detail of my life, and I couldn't bear that. Not yet. Not until I'd figured out how to do this alone, how to prove that I didn't need rescue, that I could exist in the margins without becoming invisible. The work that did come through was supplementary. Small assignments that paid in the $300 to $400 range. Photography for community centers, small galleries, nonprofit fundraisers. The kind of work that didn't appear in major publications but paid the bills in increments. I'd become expert at angles that minimized my profile, at leaving shoots early, at negotiating remote editing arrangements. My portfolio had grown stale. The cutting-edge pieces I'd created before the pregnancy gathering dust while I accepted assignments beneath my actual skill level. That night, I wasn't supposed to take the park shortcut. It was something I'd learned during early pregnancy. After the first trimester, I'd started taking the long way around, the safer route through lit streets, past businesses still open at 9, past people. But the weather had turned aggressive. The forecast had warned of heavy rain, and the clouds had made good on that promise within the first 10 minutes of my drive. By the time I parked near the main entrance, visibility had dropped to something approaching reckless. I sat in the car for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, assessing. The direct route home was 4 miles, 20 minutes in normal traffic. The park cut that almost in half, maybe 8 minutes if I moved with purpose. The rain was making everything shimmer and bleed in the streetlights. Pregnancy had made me conservative in ways I'd never been before. Every decision filtered through the lens of risk assessment, of protecting something that couldn't protect itself. But exhaustion, and the steady percussion of water on the roof wore down my better judgment. I told myself it wasn't recklessness so much as triage. The lot by the park meant fewer flooded intersections, fewer blind turns with drivers panicking under a sky that had turned to static. 8 minutes of wet pavement, I bargained, instead of 20 of hydroplaning glass. It wasn't bravery. It was a calculus made by someone who had been negotiating with fear for months and had learned to pick the smaller monster. I grabbed my camera bag, locked the car, and headed toward the park entrance. The paths were slick and my balance had been compromised for months now. The weight distribution was all wrong. I'd learned to walk with hands splayed slightly, the way animals braced themselves before a fall. The bag hung awkwardly across my body, heavy with equipment I kept meaning to offload, but couldn't quite bring myself to abandon. Even pregnant and alone, I maintained the obsessive relationship with my work that had defined my adult life. The park at night in the rain had a particular quality, a dissolution of boundaries, as if the usual geography no longer applied. The trees dripped in that particular way of late autumn, leaves plastered against bark and concrete, the smell of earth and decomposition rising up from the mulched areas. My sneakers were soaked within the first 100 yards. Water had found its way through the gaps in my jacket, and my fingers were going numb. The bench appeared before I'd fully processed that I was approaching it, just there, beneath the old oak tree that had stood for what felt like centuries, on the exact path that cut through the northwestern section of the park. This bench. The one where I'd encountered a man 3 years ago when I was photographing the urban landscape, chasing light through concrete and shadow. He'd been sitting, entirely still, watching the people moving past him with the focused attention of someone observing a species he didn't quite understand. I'd photographed him without permission, and he'd caught me at it. Instead of anger, there'd been that curious smile, the one that suggested he found my boldness entertaining. That had been the beginning of everything. I would have walked past without stopping if the light hadn't caught him wrong. Or maybe it caught him exactly right, illuminating something that made my stomach drop, past the point where the baby could kick. He was sitting on the bench, the same bench, soaked through, his expensive coat clinging to his frame, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and in his lap, held with careful deliberation despite the rain, were roses, red ones, the kind that meant something specific, the kind you gave when you were marking an anniversary or a grave. My first instinct was to keep walking, to move through the moment like a ghost, to pretend I hadn't seen him, to pretend that my body hadn't gone rigid in recognition. But movement had become a production at 8 months pregnant, and he looked up at the small sound of my feet shifting on the wet concrete. His gaze connected with mine, and in that brief, suspended second, I saw understanding flicker behind his eyes. He knew me. Despite the time, despite whatever I'd done to disappear from his world, his expression shifted from melancholy to something that approached shock, and then his eyes moved downward. I watched it happen like watching a door open onto a room he hadn't known existed. His focus dropped to my abdomen, taking in the unmistakable swell beneath my soaked jacket, the weight I'd been carrying with such careful intention to hide it from the world. The roses tightened in his grip. A single petal detached and fell to the wet concrete between us, and I realized with a clarity that felt almost violent that whatever had brought him to this bench, to this specific spot in the rain, holding flowers like an offering to a ghost, my existence here was about to shatter whatever narrative he'd constructed to survive my absence. He began to stand. He straightened, and the roses hung forgotten in his right hand. For a moment, neither of us moved. The rain continued its assault, turning the world into something fluid and uncertain, and I was acutely aware that my body had betrayed me in the most obvious way possible. There was no hiding this. There was no explanation that would make sense of the visible swell beneath my jacket, the way my stance had shifted to accommodate the weight, the unmistakable evidence of months I'd spent trying to convince myself I could handle this alone. Jade. He said my name like it was an incantation, like speaking it aloud might collapse the space between us or make me disappear again. His voice was lower than I remembered, rougher around the edges, as if 6 months of searching had worn something essential away from him. I couldn't run. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent all those months perfecting the art of running, of vanishing, and now my own body had anchored me in place. The baby shifted inside me, some lazy movement that was almost contemptuous, and I steadied myself against a park bench that wasn't the one we'd been standing near. Alessandro. I said his name back, testing how it felt after so long, like pronouncing a word in a language you'd tried to forget. You need to let me pass. No. He took a step forward, closing the distance I'd tried so carefully to maintain. The roses were forgotten now, hanging at his side, petals already sacrificing themselves to the rain. You don't get to walk past me. Not now. Not after. He stopped, his gaze tracking back down to my abdomen. How far along are you? I turned away, trying to move past him toward the path that led toward my street. My apartment was less than half a mile away. I could make it, could disappear into my building and lock the doors and pretend this encounter had never happened. But his hand caught my arm, not forcefully, just enough to stop me from moving. Don't. I said it quietly, aware that my voice was shaking in a way I hadn't anticipated. Don't do this. Do what? Try to understand where you've been, what you've been doing. His grip tightened fractionally. You've been pregnant. How long have you known? I didn't answer. Answering would require admitting things I'd spent months keeping locked away, things that would crack the careful structure I'd built to survive his absence. If I told him I'd known before I left, if I confirmed that I'd run specifically because I was carrying his child, it would change everything. He would see it as deception rather than self-preservation. He would see it as a betrayal rather than protection. Jade. His voice had taken on an edge now, something sharp beneath the shock. Answer me. How long have you known you were pregnant? Long enough. I pulled my arm free and started walking. My pace was slower than I would have liked, hampered by the weight and by exhaustion that had become as much a part of me as breathing. Long enough to make my own decisions about what I needed to do. He kept pace with me easily, his longer stride requiring almost no effort. Your decisions? You made a decision that affected both of us without any input from me. You made a decision to disappear while carrying my... Your what? I cut him off, stopping in the middle of the path. Rain was running down my face now, mixing with something that might have been tears, or might have been just the general dissolution of the evening into something unbearable. Say it. Your what? Your possession? Your property? Because that's what this comes down to, isn't it? You didn't want me to leave. You wanted me to stay, to accept the life you'd built, to pretend that what you do, who you are, doesn't matter. And when I asked you to choose differently, when I asked you to be different, you couldn't do it. So I made the choice you wouldn't make. He was quiet for a long moment. The roses were soaked through now, barely recognizable as flowers anymore, just darkened pulp and stems. You asked me to leave everything. Do you understand what that means? It's not a choice. It's not something I can just walk away from. Then that's your answer. I started moving again. That's why I left. You didn't leave because I chose the business over you. He was closer now, his voice pitched low so that only I could hear it beneath the sound of the rain. You left for another reason. You left because you knew you were pregnant, and you didn't want me involved. You didn't want this baby connected to who I am, to what I do. I didn't deny it. Denying it would be another lie layered on top of all the others, and I was too tired to maintain that level of deception. Instead, I kept walking, my breathing becoming labored as the incline of the path increased slightly. Pregnancy had made simple exercise feel like climbing a mountain. I'd learned to accept that my body didn't belong entirely to me anymore, that it had been colonized by this life that was partly him, partly me, entirely separate from both of us. Look at you. His tone had shifted, become almost gentle in a way that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. You're 8 months along, walking alone in the rain. Do you have money? Do you have medical care? Do you have anything besides that camera bag you've been clutching like it matters? I have what I need. The lie came automatically now, polished by months of repetition. You're alone. He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. You're alone and pregnant and pretending you're fine. But you're not fine. You're exhausted. You're wet. You're carrying a child that needs what? I stopped again, turning to face him fully. That needs a father who's involved with organized crime. That needs to grow up in a world where people get hurt for leverage. That needs to learn that love is just another tool for control. My voice had risen, and I didn't care anymore who might hear. There was no one else in the park, no one else watching us dissolve into this conversation beneath the trees. This baby needs to be safe, Alessandro. And you couldn't offer me that. So I offered it to myself. His expression hardened, and for a moment I saw beneath the shock to the man underneath, the man who'd been raised in a world where love and violence were often synonymous. The man who probably thought that my rejection of his protection was a rejection of him. rather than a desperate attempt to give our child something neither of us had ever really had. "You need to come with me." He said it like it wasn't negotiable, like the years that had passed between us hadn't happened, like I was still someone who could be ordered around. "You need somewhere dry. You need medical attention. Whatever happened between us, that hasn't changed." "No." I turned away again, using the momentum to keep moving down the path. "I've handled this alone. I'll continue handling it alone. By taking shortcuts through parks in the middle of a downpour?" He caught up to me again, and this time he positioned himself in front of me, forcing me to stop or collide with him. "This isn't about us anymore. This is about the fact that you're endangering yourself and a child. My child. And I won't stand here and watch that happen." "Then don't," I said, softer than I meant to. "Help me without owning me. If you want me to trust your protection, let it look like protection, not custody. One night, neutral ground, a doctor in the morning, no negotiations about anything else." I could have pushed past him. Probably. My center of gravity was too compromised to do it gracefully. But desperation might have lent me the necessary momentum. Instead, I found myself negotiating, which was its own kind of defeat. "If I agree to come with you, it's just for tonight." I said it like I was laying down terms in a boardroom rather than standing in the rain with my entire life falling apart. "One night, a place to stay that's not my apartment, and then tomorrow, we figure out how to manage this situation without destroying each other in the process." He nodded, but his expression suggested he thought he'd just won something much larger than one night of shelter. "There's a hotel, neutral ground. I can arrange it." The drive to the hotel was conducted mostly in silence. His car was exactly the kind of vehicle I'd expected. Luxury that announced itself through every detail, from the leather that probably cost more than my rent to the kind of quiet efficiency that only money could buy. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his thigh, and I watched the city pass by the windows like we weren't in the midst of some kind of personal catastrophe. At a red light, he looked over at me. "Have you been to a doctor? A real doctor? Public clinic? Everything's fine." "That's not what I asked. That's the only answer you're getting right now." I was too tired to explain the logistics of my pregnancy, the choices I'd made about care, the careful calculations about cost and access that had shaped every decision. Those were my calculations to make, my body to monitor, my child to protect. His involvement felt like a violation of the autonomy I'd so carefully constructed. The hotel was in the downtown area, the kind of place that catered to business travelers and people having affairs. He used a credit card to check in, and within 15 minutes, we were in a room on the 8th floor with a view of the city skyline. The space felt too large, too empty, too full of the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that still needed to happen. "There's a bathtub." He gestured toward the bathroom. "Hot water, clean towels. You should dry off before you catch something." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Moving toward the bathroom, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, wet, bedraggled, visibly pregnant. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, someone I didn't entirely recognize. Someone who'd been running so hard for so long that she'd almost forgotten what standing still felt like. When I emerged an hour later, Alessandro was standing by the window, looking out at the city. He'd showered as well, changed into clothes he must have kept in the car, and for a moment, he looked almost normal. Almost like the person I'd known before the Mafia had fully claimed him, before the darkness had become so integral to who he was that it was impossible to separate the man from the organization. "We need to talk about what happens next." He said it without turning around. "Not tonight." I moved toward one of the chairs, settling into it with the careful maneuvering that had become necessary. "Tonight I sleep. Tomorrow we figure out how to coexist in the same world without destroying it." He finally turned to look at me. In the lamplight from the window, his features were softer, less defined by the harshness of the rain and the shock. For just a moment, I could see the man I'd fallen for, the one who'd seemed like a contradiction, powerful and gentle at the same time, capable of tenderness within a context of absolute control. "Tomorrow you're seeing a real doctor." He said it like it was settled. Complete examination, no arguments. I was too exhausted to argue anyway. The pregnancy had drained something fundamental from my resistance. and I found myself simply nodding agreement to things I might have fought under different circumstances. The irony of disappearing only to end up dependent on the one person I'd been running from wasn't lost on me, but I was too tired to do anything about it. He moved toward the second bed, maintaining distance that felt both respectful and pointed. "We'll figure this out in the morning." But as I lay in the darkness of that hotel room, listening to his breathing steady into the rhythm of sleep, I wondered exactly what there was to figure out. We existed in separate worlds. His was one of violence and control, and the kind of power that came from operating outside the law. Mine was one of survival and independence, and the desperate attempt to build something untouched by his reality. Those worlds couldn't coexist. One of us would have to surrender, and I wasn't yet ready to admit that I might be the one who would have to yield. Sleep never came easily anymore. The pregnancy had stolen that luxury somewhere around month 5, and by month 8, rest had become something I negotiated with my own body rather than surrendered into. I lay in the hotel bed listening to Alessandro breathe on the other side of the room, the sound steady and deep in a way that suggested he'd managed unconsciousness without difficulty. The privilege of men who didn't carry consequences in their bodies. The room was dark, except for the ambient glow filtering through the curtains from the city below. I traced the outline of my belly beneath the hotel sheets, a gesture that had become unconscious routine. Inside this swollen landscape lived the reason for every choice I'd made in the past 6 months. Every document forged, every bridge burned, every moment of paralyzing loneliness. My mind drifted backward to the beginning, which had been so ordinary, it was almost laughable. 3 years earlier, I'd been in that same park on a Tuesday afternoon, hunting for specific angles of light through urban landscape. The kind of project that used to matter to me before pregnancy had recalibrated my entire sense of what mattered. I'd been lying on my back on the concrete, camera angled upward toward the canopy, when I'd noticed him. He was sitting on a bench about 30 yards away, utterly still, watching people move through the park with the kind of attention most people reserved for television screens. There was something unsettling about that stillness. In a city where everyone moved with desperate purpose, where standing still was considered a waste of time and resources, his immobility felt subversive. I'd photographed him without permission, capturing the way his tailored suit contradicted the park setting, the way his expression suggested he was cataloging something no one else could see. When he'd caught me at it, when he'd turned and made direct eye contact with the camera lens, I'd expected confrontation. Instead, he'd smiled. A real smile. Not the practiced expression of someone accustomed to social performance, but something that suggested genuine amusement. I'd approached him afterward with the recklessness of someone who hadn't yet learned what caution felt like. "Those are mine." I'd said it pointing to the camera, but we both understood I meant the photographs. "I'm aware." He'd stood, and I'd realized how tall he was, how the expensive suit was tailored to accommodate a body built for something more violent than boardroom meetings. "What will you do with them?" "That depends." I'd assessed him more carefully then, trying to categorize what I was seeing. "Are you going to make a legal issue out of it?" He'd laughed then, a sound that had seemed to reshape the entire afternoon around us. "Take the photographs. Use them however you want. I trust you'll find something interesting to do with them." That had been the beginning. Encounters that became routine. Coffee meetings that bled into dinners. Conversations where I'd realized he had more depth than his appearance suggested, more vulnerability than his profession should have allowed. I'd fallen in love with him in increments so gradual I hadn't noticed the moment it became total. The complications had emerged later. I'd done research because that was the kind of person I was. Thorough, obsessive, unable to accept surface presentations of reality. I'd discovered that Alessandro Ravellini wasn't just wealthy. He was connected to operations that made wealth seem incidental to power. The organization that bore his family name had roots deeper than Boston's historical foundations. When I'd confronted him about it, he hadn't denied anything. He'd simply said that was who he was, and if I couldn't accept that, I should leave. I hadn't left then. Instead, I'd convinced myself that love could be a transformative force, that my presence in his life could somehow negotiate a compromise between the darkness and whatever light he still possessed. It was the kind of naive belief that only works when you haven't yet experienced the specific weight of organized crime as a reality rather than an abstraction. The final argument had happened 7 months ago. I'd asked him directly to leave it all behind. Not to abandon his family. I wasn't so naive as to think that was possible. But to extract himself from the operational side of things. To exist in the legitimate businesses that the family maintained as cover. To be present in a way that didn't require him to participate in activities that destroyed other people's lives. He'd looked at me with something like pity. That's not how this works, Jade. You're asking me to become someone different. You're asking me to betray the men who've trusted me. To dishonor agreements made in blood. You're asking the impossible. I'm asking you to choose me over the business. I can't do that. The business is me. It's who I've been since before I understood what choice even meant. I'd left that conversation and spent the following week in a state of dissociation. I'd gone to work. I'd eaten. I'd maintained the basic functions of existence while my mind spiraled through scenarios where I tried to convince him. Scenarios where I left him. Scenarios where I built some kind of compromise between his world and the one I needed. Then I'd missed my period, and the test had been positive. And everything had crystallized into a terrible, obvious clarity. I'd known immediately that I couldn't stay. Not because I was afraid of him. I'd never been afraid of Alessandro himself. I was afraid of what his world would do to a child. I'd researched it obsessively once I'd confirmed the pregnancy, spending hours in the dim lighting of my apartment reading accounts of children raised in organized crime families. The statistics were brutal. The outcomes ranged from damaged to destroyed. Children used as leverage. Children groomed for participation. Children who never learned that normal life could exist outside of power structures built on violence and fear. My child would not have that life. I'd made that decision while still in the bathroom of a clinic, staring at a positive test strip like it was an oracle that had just rewritten my entire future. I'd told no one. Not my mother. Not my friends. Not anyone who might have insisted on involving Alessandro, or tried to convince me that my choice was unnecessarily severe. I'd spent 2 weeks arranging the escape while he was away on business. Selling my camera equipment hurt more than I'd anticipated. Those cameras had been part of my identity, the tools through which I'd understood the world, but they'd purchased documents, purchased silence, purchased a new existence that didn't intersect with the one I was leaving behind. Now, 6 months into that existence, I understood what it meant to be truly alone. Pregnancy had been a private experience. Every milestone witnessed only by myself and the impersonal professionals who staffed public health clinics. I'd discovered the baby's sex through an ultrasound technician who'd mentioned it casually before moving on to the next patient. I'd chosen the name, Lucia, while lying in bed at 3 a.m, unable to sleep because the baby was active and the apartment was silent, and I was fundamentally, profoundly alone. Margaret had called repeatedly during those 6 months. I'd let it go to voicemail, had texted back vague reassurances about work and life and nothing specific that would invite further questioning. She'd known something was wrong. I could hear it in her voice during rare conversations where I'd felt strong enough to engage, but I'd maintained the careful distance that kept her from discovering the truth. The guilt about that was its own kind of pain. Margaret had raised me alone, had sacrificed her own life to give me choices and security, and the belief that I could build something independent. And I'd repaid that by shutting her out during a time when her support would have meant everything. But I'd been afraid that she would try to convince me to tell Alessandro, afraid that her practical approach to problems would collide with my desperation to protect this child from inherited darkness. I'd built the isolation deliberately, brick by brick, until I'd existed in a world that contained only myself and my pregnancy, and the desperate hope that I could raise a daughter who would never know the specific weight of being born into a family like Alessandro's. And then I'd encountered him in the rain, and he'd looked at my belly, and every careful architecture of separation had collapsed. The first hints of dawn were appearing at the edges of the curtains when Alessandro stirred. I heard him shift on the other bed, heard him wake with the kind of alertness that suggested his sleep had been lighter than it appeared. He sat up, and I pretended to still be resting, unwilling to engage with him in the early morning when my defenses were lowest and my need for comfort was highest. The bathroom light came on, and I heard the shower start. I lay in the darkness of the hotel room, feeling the baby move inside me, and wondered how I was going to navigate a world where Alessandro Ravellini was no longer content to be absent from his child's existence. I'd spent 6 months believing I could protect her from him. Now I was beginning to understand that he was fundamentally unprotectable from her, and whatever choices I'd made to try to prevent that intersection were about to become irrelevant. The shower stopped. I closed my eyes and waited for whatever came next, which felt like waiting for an ending I'd never managed to prevent, despite my best efforts to rewrite it. The medical office occupied the entire 14th floor of a building that gleamed with the kind of wealth that didn't announce itself loudly. Alessandro had made a phone call from the car while I sat in the passenger seat, watching the city transition from the neighborhoods I inhabited into the ones that existed in different economies entirely. By the time we arrived, the doctor was ready to see me. No waiting room, no outdated magazines, no fluorescent lighting that made everyone look vaguely diseased. Just a private practice that catered to people who could afford discretion. The obstetrician was a woman in her 60s named Dr. Mehta, and she treated me with the kind of professional neutrality that suggested she didn't particularly care about the circumstances under which I'd become pregnant, or why I was arriving for a checkup in the company of a man who looked at me with the intensity of someone studying a puzzle he couldn't solve. She performed an ultrasound while Alessandro remained in the waiting area, and I was grateful for his absence during the examination. The intimacy of pregnancy required witnesses sometimes, but not always. Not when those witnesses were trying to process the fact that they'd missed months of a child's development. Everything looked good, Dr. Mehta informed me. The baby was measuring appropriately for gestational age. Heart rate was strong. No signs of complications. I was approximately 8.5 months along, which aligned with the timeline I'd been carrying in my head since the positive test. Due date was roughly 3 weeks away, give or take the unpredictability of nature. Alessandro was waiting when I emerged from the examination room, and I could see the question written across his face before he asked it. The obstetrician had mentioned nothing personal, had given no details, but his expression suggested he was trying to extract information through sheer force of will. "Everything is fine," I told him. "The baby is healthy. I'm healthy. Everything is on track." The restaurant he chose was in the financial district, the kind of place that required reservations weeks in advance unless you were the sort of person who could request a table and have one materialize immediately. We were seated in a private alcove, and I realized with something like resignation that he'd orchestrated that privacy deliberately. This wasn't going to be a casual lunch. This was going to be a negotiation. "You need to stop working," he said once we were alone, before we'd even looked at menus. "Whatever freelance assignments you've been taking, they need to end immediately. I need the income." I reached for water, trying to ground myself in something concrete. I need to pay my rent. I need to eat. Those things require money. "You won't need money." He said it with the casual certainty of someone accustomed to solving problems through resource allocation. "I'll provide for you. After the baby is born, after you've recovered, we'll figure out what comes next. But right now, your job is to take care of yourself and the pregnancy. That's it." I wanted to argue that I was perfectly capable of managing my own life, that his offer of financial support came with invisible strings attached that would gradually tighten until I couldn't move without his permission. But I was also 8 months pregnant and exhausted by the weight of trying to manage everything alone. The idea of security, even security with complications, held a terrible appeal. "And my apartment?" I asked. "My things? Pack whatever matters to you. I have a place in the city. You'll stay there. Safer. Better neighborhood. Medical care within minutes if anything goes wrong." There it was. The subtle shift from offer to requirement. The movement from suggestion into control. I'd known it would happen eventually. I just hoped for more time before it did. "I can't just move in with you, Alessandro. That sends a message that what? That I want to be involved in my child's life? That I want to ensure you're protected?" He leaned back in his chair, and the waiter appeared almost instantly to take our order. We both waved him away. "You disappeared for 6 months. You hid this pregnancy from me. I missed the ultrasounds, the development, all of it. I'm not going to miss any more." The accusation in that statement hung between us, and I felt something crystallize inside me. The moment I'd been dreading since the instant I'd seen him on that bench in the rain had finally arrived. The moment where I had to explain the choices I'd made and justify them to someone who felt entitled to answers. "I need to tell you something," I said quietly. "Something I should have said last night." But I couldn't. I wasn't ready. He waited, his expression hardening into something that suggested he already knew what was coming and didn't like the shape of it. I discovered I was pregnant 2 weeks after our last conversation. The one where you said you couldn't leave the business. I found out while you were in Italy for whatever you were doing with your organization. I watched him absorb this information, watched his hands clench against the table edge. I took the test, and I saw the positive result, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. You left. He said it like he was confirming a theory he'd been working through. I left, because I knew if I told you, you would never let me go. You would have convinced me to stay, or you would have forced me to stay, or you would have entangled yourself in my pregnancy in a way that made extraction impossible. And I couldn't. My voice cracked slightly, and I pressed my palms against the table to steady myself. I couldn't raise our daughter in the world you inhabit. I couldn't watch her grow up thinking violence was a legitimate response to conflict. I couldn't let her become a tool for leverage or leverage against you, or a reason for people to hurt us both. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping back with a sound that made other diners glance in our direction. I thought for a moment he was going to leave, was going to walk out of the restaurant, and out of both our lives in a demonstration of the kind of power he usually reserved for business negotiations. Instead, he walked to the window and stood with his back to me, his shoulders held so rigidly they looked like they might snap. "You've been pregnant for 6 months," he said to the glass. 6 months of carrying my daughter. And you didn't think I deserved to know. You didn't think I deserved a choice about whether I wanted to be involved. You already made your choice. I remained seated, my hands shaking slightly as I lifted the water glass to my lips. When you told me you couldn't leave the business, when you made it clear that your organization came first, that's when you made your choice. I just accepted it and moved on with the consequences. He turned to face me, and the expression I saw there was something I'd never quite witnessed before. Grief, rage, betrayal, all of it layered over the kind of magua that came from loving someone and feeling that love thrown back at you as rejection. "I had a right to know," he said, his voice so low it was almost conversational. "Regardless of everything else, regardless of our situation, I had a right to know that I was going to be a father." "No," I said it firmly, drawing on reserves of conviction I wasn't entirely sure I possessed. "You had the right to make choices for your own life. I had the right to make choices for mine and for hers. You chose the Ravellini family. I chose to protect my daughter from becoming collateral in your world. Those are both valid choices. They're just incompatible with each other." The waiter approached again, hovering uncertainly at the edge of our private alcove. Alessandro dismissed him with a gesture that was more frustrated than hostile. He returned to the table and sat, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The restaurants around us continued their quiet commerce, whispered conversations, the clink of silverware, the choreography of wealth in motion. "I need to know everything," he finally said. "How much you've spent, where you've been living, what kind of prenatal care you've been receiving, everything. I've been at a public clinic. The care is adequate, though not luxurious. I've been living in an apartment in a neighborhood you would probably consider beneath your notice. And I've spent exactly what I needed to spend to survive." I met his gaze. "I've managed, Alessandro. I know you think I needed your resources. But I was managing. Barely." The word came out sharp. "You were barely managing. Walking alone in the rain at night because you had nowhere else to be. Working yourself to exhaustion for money that never quite covered everything. Managing is what people do when they're drowning and trying to pretend they know how to swim." His assessment was uncomfortably accurate, and I hated him for seeing through the narrative I'd constructed about my independence and survival. I hated him because he was right. I hated him because his right to be involved in his child's life was colliding with my right to raise her in safety, and there was no version of this situation where both things were possible. "So, what do you want from me?" I asked. "What exactly do you need me to do?" "I want you to stop living like this. I want you to accept my help. I want you to acknowledge that I deserve to be present for my daughter's birth and her childhood and her entire life. And I want you to accept that whether you like it or not, you're connected to me now in a way that can't be undone." The implication hung between us, unspoken, but perfectly clear. I could accept his terms, or I could continue in the direction I'd been traveling. But I couldn't have both. I couldn't have his support and my independence. I couldn't have his protection and my autonomy. I would have to choose, and neither option felt entirely acceptable. I need to think, I said finally. I can't just accept all of this without considering what it means. We don't have unlimited time. His voice had returned to something more controlled, more businesslike. You're 3 weeks from giving birth. After that, everything changes. The baby will be here, and I will be part of her life, whether you cooperate or not. It would be better if you chose to cooperate. It sounded like a threat, though not in the way that would have registered as violent. It was the threat of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, saying what would happen if I continued to resist. And the terrifying part was that I didn't know if he was capable of following through, or if he was simply stating facts as he understood them. We left the restaurant without eating. I felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with hunger, and everything to do with the realization that my choices were collapsing into a narrower and narrower range of possibilities. I'd thought I could protect Lucia from Alessandro's world simply by refusing to acknowledge that he existed. I'd thought that disappearance was a permanent solution. Now I understood that it had only been a temporary reprieve, and the bill for that reprieve was about to come due in the form of compromise and concession. In the car on the way back to my apartment so I could gather my things, I didn't speak. Alessandro didn't attempt conversation. The silence between us was different now. Not the silence of two people separated by mutual decision, but the silence of two people beginning to understand that they were far more entangled than either of them had realized, and that untangling wasn't actually possible anymore. The first photograph arrived via courier to the hotel on a Tuesday morning. Alessandro was already gone, conducting business that I'd learned not to ask about. I found the envelope on the table near the door, pristine and unmarked except for the word Ravellini, written in block letters. Inside was an image of me from 3 days earlier outside the prenatal clinic. I was identifiable, unmistakably pregnant, completely vulnerable. Someone had positioned themselves to capture the exact moment I was walking toward the clinic entrance, my hand on my lower back, my gait the particular waddle of someone 8 months along. The photograph was technically perfect, which made it infinitely more terrifying than if it had been amateur. Someone with skill and resources had documented me going about the most intimate aspect of my life. There was no note, no explanation, just the photograph and the implicit message contained within it. We know where you are. We know what you're doing. We can reach you whenever we choose. I called Alessandro immediately, and he returned to the hotel within 20 minutes. He took the photograph from my shaking hands and examined it with an expression that cycled through shock to fury to something colder and more calculating. Versiani. He said it like pronouncing a curse. He's moving faster than I anticipated. Who is Versiani? My voice came out smaller than I wanted. Who sends people to photograph women at doctors' offices? Someone who wants leverage against me. Alessandro set the photograph down, like it had contaminated his hands. Someone who competes for territory and profit, and ultimately for respect within certain circles. He's been trying to encroach on my operations for the past year. This is his way of letting me know he understands my vulnerabilities. Your vulnerabilities? I moved away from him, suddenly terrified of how close he was standing. Alessandro, he photographed me. He knows I'm pregnant. He knows about the baby. How is that a vulnerability? That's a direct threat to our child. Which is precisely why I won't allow anything to happen to you. His response was delivered with absolute certainty. Versiani understands one thing: consequences. If anything occurs that jeopardizes you or this pregnancy, I will dismantle his operations methodically and personally. He knows that. That's why the photograph is meant as communication rather than action. He's establishing that he has access. He's asking me to negotiate. Over the following days, more evidence of surveillance emerged. A note left at the hotel front desk with my apartment address written inside it. A delivery man who lingered too long outside the lobby. A black car that appeared to be following us when we drove through the city. Each new piece of evidence pressed against my carefully constructed sense of safety, crushing it incrementally until I could barely breathe through the anxiety. I'd thought disappearing would protect me. I'd believed that by removing myself from Alessandro's world, I could exist in some neutral space where the violence and threat assessment that characterized his life couldn't reach me. I'd been catastrophically naive. By being connected to Alessandro through pregnancy and this child we'd created together, I had entered his world whether I'd wanted to or not. And Matteo Verciani had just demonstrated that there was no escape hatch, no exit door, no way to pretend that I existed outside the sphere of consequence. On the 4th day of the photographs and threats, I sent a text to my mother's number. My hands shook as I typed out the message. Years of deliberate distance collapsing in the face of genuine fear. I need to talk to you. Something important. Something I should have told you months ago. Can you meet me for coffee? Please don't ask questions. Just yes or no. Her response came within minutes. Yes. When? Where? We met at a neutral location, a cafe in Cambridge where neither of us had history. Margaret arrived first, and I watched her register my appearance before she registered anything else. At 8 months pregnant, there was no hiding the truth anymore. Her expression cycled through shock to understanding to something that looked remarkably like hurt. How far along? She asked it quietly, after I'd settled across from her with as much grace as pregnancy allowed. 8 months. Due date is about 3 weeks away. And you were planning to call me approximately 3 weeks from now? After you'd given birth alone? The accusation wasn't spoken with anger, which somehow made it worse. My mother had spent 28 years raising me alone, had sacrificed her own life for my autonomy and security, and I'd repaid that sacrifice by completely excluding her from the most significant event of my adult life. I was planning to tell you after everything was stable, after I'd figured out how to manage it. I didn't want you to worry. I didn't want you to try to convince me to. I stopped, realizing how the sentence sounded, how it revealed the depth of my distrust in her motivations. To involve the father. She finished it for me. To accept help from someone who could provide it. To admit that sometimes independence requires asking for assistance. I explained everything then. The relationship with Alessandro, his involvement with organized crime, my decision to leave, the discovery of pregnancy, the months of isolation, the reenactment in the rain, and finally, the photographs and the threats that had made it clear that my attempt to create a separate existence had been futile. Margaret listened without interrupting. She was a nurse, which meant she was accustomed to hearing terrible information without flinching. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. You tried to protect this child alone, because you thought that was the only way to protect her from Alessandro's world. But you've just described a situation where she's no safer alone with you than she would be with him. In fact, she might be more endangered, because at least with him, there are resources to counter threats. At least with him, there's power protecting both of you rather than just desperation and hope. You're saying I should accept his help. You're saying I should move in with him, let him take over, surrender the autonomy I've fought so hard to maintain. I'm saying that autonomy is a luxury you might not be able to afford right now, and there's no shame in acknowledging that. She squeezed my hand. I want to meet this man. I want to understand what we're dealing with, and then we'll figure out what comes next. Alessandro was waiting in the car when I emerged from the cafe. He'd positioned himself where he could watch the entrance without being obvious about it. I'd stopped questioning his protective surveillance in the past few days. It had begun to feel like baseline reality rather than violation. I told my mother everything, I said as I climbed into the passenger seat. I want you to meet her. I want her to understand who you are and what this situation actually is. He was quiet for a moment. Is that wise? No. It's probably incredibly unwise. But she deserves to know. And I paused, searching for the right words. I need someone else to know what's happening. Someone who cares about me and can help me think through this without the layers of manipulation and history between us. You think I'm manipulating you? I think we're manipulating each other. I think I've been trying to control a situation that's fundamentally uncontrollable, and you've been trying to own something that can't be owned. And meanwhile, there's a child about to enter the world, and neither of us has the luxury of continuing this particular power struggle. That evening, Alessandro moved me to his residence. It wasn't discussed as a suggestion. The decision had already been made, and my acceptance was simply the formality of acknowledging what was inevitable. The house was in the suburbs, a sprawling contemporary structure that announced wealth without the gratuitousness of actively trying. There were security measures I hadn't known existed. Cameras, reinforced entry points, a perimeter that felt like a fortress wrapped in the aesthetic of modern architecture. "Versiani knows where you've been staying," Alessandro explained, as he showed me to one of the guest rooms. The hotel was a temporary solution, but it wasn't secure enough. "Here, you're protected. Here, no one gets close without my explicit permission." I should have felt caged. Instead, I felt something closer to relief. The burden of maintaining constant vigilance had been exhausting. The idea of someone else taking responsibility for security, even someone whose methods I questioned, held an appeal that I couldn't entirely reject. Margaret met Alessandro 3 days later. She came to the house, and I watched her take in the scale of his world, the furnishings, the security, the careful way that he'd arranged everything. They spoke privately for nearly an hour while I waited in another room, anxiety spiraling through me with each passing minute. When they emerged, Margaret looked thoughtful rather than horrified, which I interpreted as either a very good sign or a very bad one. "He loves you," she said to me privately afterward. "I don't entirely understand his methods, and I'm not convinced that his lifestyle is conducive to raising a healthy child. But the feeling is genuine, and he's terrified of losing both of you. That's something to work with." On the 7th day of isolation in Alessandro's fortress of a house, Matteo Versiani made his move. 2 cars appeared at the perimeter of the property, attempting to breach the gates. What happened next I only learned about afterward. Alessandro's security team neutralized the threat with a precision that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd dealt with an incursion. Versiani's men retreated, leaving the clear message that the boundary had been tested and found impenetrable. Alessandro found me afterward, and I could see the cost of what he'd just done written across his face. Violence had a weight that it carried with it, even when it was justified, even when it was necessary. "He won't try again," Alessandro said quietly. "I've made it clear what the consequence would be if he touched you, or if he ever came close to this property again." Versiani understands that message. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know the specifics of what had been threatened or what had been sacrificed to create that boundary. But I understood that something had shifted in the landscape. By trying to use me as leverage, Versiani had crossed a line that Alessandro had drawn. And now, there would be consequences that rippled through whatever underworld structures governed his business. I'd been marked as protected territory, and that protection carried a price that extended far beyond the physical walls of this house. The house felt different after Versiani's failed attempt at the gates. What had been a prison of Alessandro's design now felt more like a sanctuary, though I understood the dangerous psychology of that shift. When people protect you from external threats, the protection itself becomes a form of entanglement. You begin to feel indebted to your captor, grateful for the very cage that confines you. I recognized this pattern intellectually. That didn't stop me from experiencing it emotionally. Alessandro had changed since the confrontation. The incident with Versiani had crystallized something in him. He moved through the house with a different quality of focus, speaking quietly on phone calls that he took in rooms I wasn't in, making decisions that felt heavy with consequence. I didn't ask him to explain. I'd begun to understand that there were aspects of his world that I didn't need to witness, information that was safer when unknown. We existed in the same space but maintained careful distance. He'd given me the master suite, taking a guest room himself as though proximity might contaminate me. It was a strange form of respect, or perhaps it was guilt. Or perhaps it was simply his way of maintaining control, ensuring that I understood the hierarchy of the household while simultaneously demonstrating restraint. 2 weeks before my due date, I finally asked him directly about his childhood. We were in the kitchen, an unusually domestic setting that felt surreal given the context of our relationship. He was making tea, moving around the space with unexpected competence, and I found myself watching him perform this simple task like it was a moment that might explain everything. "Tell me about your family," I said. "Tell me about growing up in this world." He was quiet for a long moment, the kettle heating water in the background. "There's nothing redemptive in that story. You should know that before I start. I'm not looking for redemption. I'm looking for understanding." He set cups on the counter with careful precision. I was 4 years old when my father took me to my first meeting. Not by accident. Deliberately. He wanted me to understand that this was my inheritance, my obligation, my inevitable future. By the time I was 10, I'd seen people hurt for betraying the organization. By 15, I'd been asked to choose between my personal safety and organizational loyalty, and I chose loyalty. There was no other choice available to me. There still isn't. The way he said it wasn't with bitterness. It was stated as fact, the way you might describe the weather or the time of day. Simple and absolute. You could have left, I said, though I already knew better. Could I? He poured the tea with steady hands. Where would I go? Who would protect me from the people I'd crossed? What kind of life would I have with a target on my back for abandoning my family? And more fundamentally than all of that, who would I be without this? The organization isn't something I do. It's who I am. You asked me to leave it like you were asking me to amputate a limb and still expect me to function. That's not love. That's annihilation dressed up in romantic language. I understood then that I hadn't been cruel to leave, but I also understood that he wasn't wrong. And that understanding changed something fundamental about how I perceived both of us. The conversation with Margaret happened a week later at a cafe in Cambridge, neutral territory where neither of us carried complicated history. I'd asked her to meet me alone, without Alessandro, because I needed to say things that felt impossible to articulate in front of him. She ordered tea like I did, and we sat in a corner where I could see the entrance. Old habits from a life I was rapidly leaving behind. I need to explain why I didn't tell you, I began. She held up a hand. Before you do that, I need to tell you something. Alessandro called me last week. He said you weren't sleeping well, that the pregnancy was causing anxiety, that he thought hearing from me might help. He arranged the entire conversation without telling you he'd done it. He gave me permission to know the truth about all of this, so I could be a support system for you. And while I find his methods somewhat controlling, I recognized that he was trying, in his own way, to give you something you needed. The knowledge that Alessandro had orchestrated that felt invasive and considerate simultaneously. It was such a perfect encapsulation of who he was, someone who solved problems through leverage and arrangement, rather than simple human communication. He loves you, Margaret continued. I've never seen a man more terrified of losing someone. And he's trying to be better. I can see the effort it costs him to restrain certain impulses, to ask rather than demand, to negotiate rather than command. He's still involved in terrible things. He still runs an organization that hurts people. He still exists in a world built on violence. Yes, and none of that changes the fact that he's genuinely trying to protect you and this child. Those two things can both be true. Life is complicated, Jade. It's easier when people are simply good or simply bad. But Alessandro exists in the space between. And so do you, by the way. You abandoned your own mother to protect a child you hadn't even met yet. That took a particular kind of ruthlessness disguised as love. I wanted to argue with her assessment, but I couldn't. She was right. I'd been so convinced of the righteousness of my choices that I hadn't bothered to examine their cost to anyone but myself. When I returned to the house, Alessandro was in the study, working at a desk with documents spread across it. I could see the concentration on his face before he looked up and registered my presence. I spoke with your mother, I said. He set down his pen carefully. How did I know you arranged it? Because that's the kind of thing you do. You solve problems through orchestration rather than asking directly. And I'm finally tired enough to acknowledge that I understand why. You grew up in a world where direct communication got people killed, where asking for things was a liability. So you learned to navigate reality by controlling the pieces on the board. He stood slowly, like moving too quickly might spook me. I didn't mean it as an intrusion. I know, but it is an intrusion. And I'm going to keep calling it that when it happens. I'm not going to become grateful for the violation just because the intent was protective. I moved further into the room. But I'm also going to acknowledge something. I'm scared. I'm terrified of what comes next. I'm terrified of raising a daughter in this world. I'm terrified of what my choices mean for her future. And I need help. I need resources. I need your support. Not because I've been defeated by my own stubbornness, but because reality has shifted, and I'm finally honest enough to admit it. He crossed the room and pulled me into an embrace, and I felt years of tension drain from his body. When he spoke, his voice was rough. I can't leave this world. I need you to understand that completely. I can't become someone different for you or for this child. What I can do is draw a line. What I can do is ensure she grows up with choices. What I can do is build a life where she understands what I am without feeling obligated to become it. That's all I need. I whispered. That's actually all I've ever needed. We spent the following week working with we were not drafting a peace treaty as much as building a fence. High enough to keep the old world from climbing in, clear enough that our daughter would see where the boundary stood. Lawyer Alessandro employed a man named David Hale, who specialized in private family arrangements. The negotiations were conducted in that same study, with documents being drawn and redrawn until every point of contention had been addressed and formalized. The agreements were extensive and specific. Lucia, that was the name we'd finally settled on, would never be expected to participate in Alessandro's business operations. She would have the choice of her own future, education arranged away from Boston if she desired it, protection from direct involvement in organizational violence or criminality. If I ever felt that Lucia's safety was genuinely compromised, I had grounds to remove her. Alessandro would maintain financial responsibility and emotional involvement, but I retained primary decision-making authority over her upbringing. The documentation wasn't legally binding in any traditional sense. It existed in the space between legitimate law and criminal underworld, a private contract that carried weight through agreement rather than judicial enforcement. But it was binding in the way that mattered most. It was binding because both of us chose to honor it, because we'd both acknowledged that our daughter deserved something better than the inheritance we carried. On the day we signed, Alessandro's hand shook slightly as he wrote his name. I watched him and understood that for him, this was a surrender of a different kind. He was acknowledging limits. He was accepting that love sometimes meant relinquishing control. He was promising a future that would require him to be better than his own father had ever been. That evening, we lay in the darkness of the master bedroom, a space we'd been negotiating all week, finally deciding that isolation couldn't work anymore if we were going to build something sustainable. He held me carefully, one hand resting on my belly where Lucia moved, and I felt something crystallize between us. Not happiness, exactly. Something more honest. An agreement to navigate impossible terrain together, to honor the humanity in each other despite the violence that surrounded us. To try. I was wrong about you, I said into the darkness. I thought leaving was the only way to protect her. I didn't understand that you deserved the opportunity to be more than what you inherited. You were protecting her the only way you knew how. I don't blame you for that. I know, but I'm acknowledging it anyway. I'm acknowledging that you're trying. I'm acknowledging that this, what we're building, is better than the alternatives. He kissed my forehead, and we stayed like that through the night, waiting for our daughter to arrive and reshape the landscape of both our worlds in ways we couldn't yet predict, but could finally face together. The nursery came together in fragments, rather than all at once. Alessandro had opinions about security that I hadn't anticipated. Reinforced windows, monitored entry points, a state-of-the-art sound system that could alert him the moment Lucia stirred. When I objected to the fortress-like features in a space meant for an infant, he explained without defensiveness that it was simply how his mind worked. Protection was architecture. Safety was infrastructure. Love was expressed through layers of reinforcement. She needs a crib that doesn't look like it belongs in a maximum security facility, I told him one afternoon as we sorted through samples of bedding. She needs to be protected. He held up a pale yellow fabric, examining it with the same concentration he'd probably apply to business strategy. The crib is just where she sleeps. What matters is that nothing threatens her while she's vulnerable. Nothing will threaten her because she's your daughter. People target children for leverage against their parents. It happens. We prevent it with preparation and resources. He set the fabric down. This one, though, this is soft enough that it won't seem harsh, but the color is neutral enough that it won't feel explicitly feminine in a way that limits her. That had been the compromise on names as well. I'd wanted Lucia without negotiation, drawn to the Italian heritage Alessandro carried even as I'd tried so hard to escape it. He'd suggested Elizabeth, wanting something that worked in English without compromising her identity. We'd settled finally on Elizabeth Lucia Ravellini, giving her both worlds wrapped into one name. Margaret began visiting twice a week, bringing her particular brand of practical care into the house. She'd started researching nursery preparation, asking Alessandro questions about the security features with the clinical precision of a woman who'd spent her career navigating institutional systems. I watched them develop something that resembled mutual respect, built on their shared investment in my well-being and Lucia's arrival. One afternoon, Margaret helped me organize the baby clothes while Alessandro was occupied with work in another part of the house. She folded tiny outfits with reverence, and I caught her watching me with an expression I recognized as forgiveness. "I want to apologize," I said, "for shutting you out. You already have." She set down a onesie. "And I've already told you that I understand why you did it. What we're doing now is moving forward. That's more important than relitigating the past." But moving forward became complicated in the 8th month when a medical appointment revealed elevated protein in my urine and blood pressure readings that made Dr. Maida furrow her brow in a way that suggested concern. She recommended increased monitoring and discussed the possibility of early delivery if preeclampsia developed. "What does that mean for the baby?" I asked, my hand instinctively moving to my belly. "It means we keep close watch. It means we monitor your symptoms. It means if things progress, we deliver early because your health becomes the priority. Babies at this stage do well with delivery. The risk is to you if the condition isn't managed." Alessandro drove me home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel with enough force that I could see the tension in his forearms. When we arrived at the house, he went directly to his study without speaking. I understood that he was processing the knowledge that something could go wrong, that control had limits, that protection couldn't prevent every complication. Later that night, I found him in the nursery, standing in the center of the room with his hands in his pockets, looking at the crib like it was an artifact from a future that might not materialize. "It's going to be fine," I said from the doorway. "You don't know that. I know that preeclampsia is manageable. I know that Dr. Mehta is monitoring it carefully. I know that if we need to deliver early, babies do well at this stage. I know that I'm taking my medication and keeping my appointments." I crossed the room and took his hand. "I know that you're terrified, but fear doesn't change the outcome. Only preparation and trust do." The confrontation with Verciani's organization came 2 weeks later without warning. I was resting in the master bedroom, my body swollen and aching, when I heard the alarm system activate. Not a warning. A full activation that suggested something had breached the perimeter. Alessandro appeared in the doorway, fully dressed and alert. "Stay in the bedroom. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "What's happening?" "They're testing the security, trying to see how we respond." He moved toward the door. "Stay locked in. I mean it." I positioned myself by the window where I could see the front of the property without being directly visible. 2 black vehicles had positioned themselves at the gates, and men were moving toward the entrance in a formation that suggested military training. Then I watched as Alessandro's security responded, not with weapons immediately visible, but with controlled movement and communication that suggested preparation and authority. The confrontation lasted perhaps 10 minutes. I couldn't see the details, but I watched the dynamics shift. Whoever had arrived seemed to realize that the property wasn't accessible, that their leverage was theoretical rather than practical. The vehicles retreated, and within minutes, the property was silent again. Alessandro returned to the bedroom and found me standing at the window. He pulled me away gently. "You should be resting." "What happened?" "Verciani testing boundaries, testing whether the security I described was real or bluff." He got his answer. "Did they hurt anyone?" "No. We made sure of that. We contained the situation without escalation." He guided me back to bed. "This is exactly why you're here. This is why these protections exist. To keep you and Lucia safe while I address threats." I understood then, in a way I hadn't fully grasped before, that Alessandro's world wasn't theoretical anymore. It was immediate and visceral, and his commitment to protecting me from it was equally real. Whatever darkness his business involved, Whatever violence he participated in, it was all deliberately kept at a distance from me. He was constructing a boundary between his world and ours. At week 37, I went in for a routine appointment and didn't come home. The blood pressure readings were climbing, the protein levels increasing, and Dr. Mehta made the decision to admit me for monitoring. We're close enough to delivery that if this progresses significantly, we deliver early rather than risk maternal complications, she explained. I want you where we can monitor you continuously. The hospital was private, another space Alessandro had arranged through his resources. A room that felt more like a hotel than a medical facility, but with every piece of sophisticated equipment integrated seamlessly into the aesthetic. Margaret arrived within an hour. Alessandro had called her, and she came directly from her shift at the public hospital, still in her nurse's scrubs, moving with the competence of someone who'd spent decades navigating medical spaces. They're being cautious, she told me after reviewing my charts with Dr. Mehta, which is appropriate at this point. Preeclampsia is serious, but it's also manageable when you're as close to delivery as you are. Alessandro remained at my bedside in a chair that he'd brought in, maintaining a presence that was both protective and tender. He read while I rested, answered emails quietly, existed in my space without demanding attention. And when I woke in the middle of the night with anxiety spiraling through my chest, he was immediately alert, holding my hand, talking me through the panic until my breathing steadied. I'm scared, I admitted at 4 a.m. when insomnia had finally defeated me. I know. I'm scared that something will go wrong. I'm scared of labor. I'm scared of being a mother. I'm scared that my daughter will inherit your world, or inherit my damage, or both. He leaned forward. She'll inherit your strength and my commitment to protecting her from having to inherit anything but choice. That's all we can promise. Everything else is just managing fear as it arrives. By morning, the symptoms had stabilized enough that the medical team decided to attempt management rather than immediate delivery. But they kept me hospitalized, kept monitoring me, kept everything poised for intervention if needed. And I lay in that hospital bed with my mother in the visitor's chair reading a book, my partner asleep in the corner chair, my belly tight with a child about to enter the world, and I felt something shift. All the running, all the isolation, all the desperate attempt to build a life separate from Alessandro's had led me here, to this room, to this moment, where protection and love and acceptance were finally aligned rather than in opposition. Labor came at 3 a.m. on the 38th week, a sudden tightening across my abdomen that woke me from the fractured sleep I'd managed since being admitted. The contraction was distinct from the Braxton Hicks I'd been experiencing for weeks. This was something deeper, more purposeful, as though my body had finally decided that deliberation was over and action was required. I pressed the call button, and within minutes the hospital room transformed into controlled motion. Dr. Mehta appeared, checked my cervix, and confirmed what my body already knew. Labor had begun in earnest. The magnesium sulfate that had been running through my IV for 3 days continued its steady work of protecting against seizures while my body entered the final chapter of pregnancy. Alessandro was awake instantly, his hand finding mine before I'd even finished explaining what was happening. Sleep had been light for him, a constant state of readiness that came from spending his entire life expecting crisis. He squeezed my fingers, and I saw the fear cross his face before he composed it into something more controlled. "Margaret?" I asked. "I'll call her." She said to contact her the moment labor started. He was already reaching for his phone. "You're going to do this. We're going to do this." The labor progressed with the inevitable intensity that medical textbooks describe, but individual experience teaches in ways no book could capture. Contractions came in waves, each one building toward a peak and then receding, leaving me temporarily breathless and momentarily grateful before the next one arrived. The epidural helped, muffling the sharp edges of pain while allowing me to remain present in the experience rather than consumed by it. Margaret arrived within an hour, still in her nurse's clothes from the previous shift, moving with competent efficiency to my bedside. She checked the monitors, assessed my progress, and offered encouragement that felt grounded in actual understanding, rather than empty platitude. "You're doing beautifully," she said, pressing a cool cloth to my forehead. The baby's heart rate is strong. Your vitals are stable. This is going exactly as it should. The hours that followed existed in a strange temporal dimension, where minutes stretched and compressed simultaneously. Time moved differently during labor. Dr. Meta came and went, checking progress, making adjustments to medications, speaking in the calm professional tones that characterized someone who'd witnessed births hundreds of times and understood the particular vulnerability of the moment. Alessandro remained at my side, his hand in mine, his eyes tracking every monitor, every shift in my expression, every indication that something was about to happen. I realized that for all his control in other contexts, he was fundamentally powerless here. He couldn't negotiate or strategize his way through labor. He could only bear witness and support, and I could see how much that cost him. By the afternoon, the medical team began discussing the possibility of escalation. My blood pressure was rising slightly despite medication, and Dr. Mehta recommended preparing for the possibility of cesarean delivery if labor didn't progress adequately within the next few hours. "The baby is fine," she assured me. "Your vitals are being managed, but we're watching the preeclampsia very carefully. If it becomes necessary to intervene surgically, we will. The most important outcome is healthy delivery for both you and Lucia." I nodded, understanding that my preference for vaginal delivery was negotiable against the reality of medical necessity. The documentation that Alessandro and I had signed weeks earlier had included this acknowledgement, that my health would take priority, that we would accept whatever intervention was required to ensure both our survival. When the transition phase finally came, when my body shifted into the pushing phase with an intensity that eclipsed everything that had come before, I understood what they meant when they said labor could feel like your body was trying to turn itself inside out. Margaret coached my breathing. Alessandro held my hand. Dr. Mehta provided guidance with the calm authority of someone who'd guided countless women through this exact terrain. "I see the head," Dr. Mehta announced. "Good progress. You're doing beautifully. Next contraction, push as hard as you can." I pushed, drawing from reserves I didn't know I possessed, and felt something fundamental shift. The sensation was overwhelming and primal, and unlike anything I'd experienced before. My body was expelling life in the most basic sense, and every instinct screamed to complete the task. "One more push. Come on, Jade, one more." I pushed again, and suddenly there was a sensation of release, of emptying, of something leaving my body that had been part of me for 9 months. And then there was a sound, a small, indignant wail that registered as the most beautiful noise I'd ever heard. "It's a girl," Dr. Mehta announced, though we'd known that for months. Somehow hearing it spoken aloud at the moment of her arrival felt different, more real, more permanent. Beautiful, healthy girl. Let's get her cleaned up. They placed her on my chest before I'd fully processed that she existed as a separate entity. Lucia was smaller than I'd anticipated, her skin covered in vernix and blood, her eyes squeezed tightly shut, her mouth moving with the determined searching of a newborn seeking something to latch onto. She was the most perfect thing I'd ever witnessed. And she was here. And she was ours. Alessandro leaned over both of us, his hand trembling as it moved to touch our daughter's face with unexpected gentleness. I saw tears on his cheeks, and I realized I'd never actually seen him cry before. Emotional vulnerability was something he kept carefully compartmentalized. And yet here it was, breaking through every carefully constructed wall in the face of this small human who carried his blood. "Elizabeth Lucia Ravellini," I whispered, testing her full name for the first time. "Hello, baby girl." Margaret photographed the moment with her phone, capturing Alessandro's expression and my exhaustion and the absolute wonder of new life compressed into a single frame. Her professional assessment of my vital signs continued in the background. Blood pressure was manageable, bleeding was controlled, the placenta delivered successfully without complications. All of it was important. None of it mattered in the face of the small, perfect creature on my chest. The following hours dissolved into the logistics of medical recovery and infant care. Lucia was weighed and measured and tested, scoring high on every assessment. She fed within her first hour, demonstrating the instinctive knowledge that somehow lived in her newborn body. I remained connected to IV medications, to monitors, to the apparatus of medical management that continued to track my preeclampsia, while my body began the process of recovery. By evening, the symptoms were beginning to stabilize. The elevated blood pressure was responding to medication. The protein levels in my urine were beginning to normalize. Dr. Mehta explained that the only true cure for preeclampsia was delivery, and delivery had occurred. Now my body just needed time to adjust to non-pregnancy life. That night, with Lucia sleeping in the bassinet beside my hospital bed, and Alessandro in the visitor's chair with his arm extended across the space to touch our daughter's bassinet, I allowed myself to acknowledge what had just happened. The running had ended. The isolation had ended. The future had arrived, and it looked completely different from anything I'd anticipated when I'd first discovered I was pregnant. 2 days later, we left the hospital. Dr. Mehta had given me clear recovery instructions: rest, monitoring of blood pressure, delayed return to physical activity. Lucia had passed all her newborn screening tests. We were declared medically clear to return home. Alessandro drove carefully, mindful of the newborn passenger. I sat in the back seat next to Lucia's car seat, watching her sleep with the particular anxiety of someone who'd spent the entire pregnancy convinced something would go wrong. She looked impossibly small, impossibly fragile, impossibly real. The house felt different with her inside it. The nursery that Alessandro had designed with such forensic attention to security now held a sleeping infant instead of the theoretical child we'd been preparing for. Margaret had come to the house before our arrival and prepared everything, standing in the nursery when we entered, her expression a mixture of joy and vindication. "She's perfect," Margaret said, peering at Lucia through the bassinet bars. Absolutely perfect. 6 weeks later, I found myself back in the park, not because I was seeking it out deliberately, but because my morning walk had taken me past the entrance, and I'd found myself drawn to the paths I'd once avoided. The weather was different. Autumn had shifted into early winter, and the trees had lost most of their leaves. But the bench was still there, exactly as I remembered it. I was pushing the stroller, with Lucia sleeping inside, bundled into a tiny coat that made her look even smaller. Motherhood had a particular exhaustion to it, different from pregnancy's weight, but no less demanding. I moved slowly, still rebuilding strength, still adapting to a body that didn't contain another human. Alessandro appeared beside me, seemingly from nowhere in the way he had a habit of doing. He'd developed the practice of taking morning walks with us, claiming it was his preferred time to conduct business calls while Lucia slept. I suspected the truth was simpler. He wanted to observe her exist in the world, to watch her breathe and sleep, and occasionally startle in her dreams. He carried red roses wrapped in paper, a gesture that had become weekly ritual. He placed them on the bench, the same bench where I'd encountered him in the rain 6 months earlier, where we'd first locked eyes after years of separation, where everything had collapsed and reformed into something new. For her? I asked, nodding to the roses. For all of us. He looked at me, and I saw in his expression something that had shifted since Lucia's birth. The fear had transformed into something else, a kind of fierce protection that no longer needed to be justified or explained. For the woman who gave her to me, for the child who gave me a reason to try to be better, for us, who managed to survive impossible circumstances and build something real. I reached out and took his hand, and we stood together watching our sleeping daughter, the three of us existing in a moment that felt precarious and solid simultaneously. "I used to think I could protect her by keeping her separate from your world," I said quietly. I didn't understand that separation wasn't protection. Love was protection. Resources were protection. Commitment was protection. "You protected her by running. I protected her by staying. Maybe what she really needed was both." He pulled me closer, careful not to jostle the stroller. "We're going to raise her in the space between our two worlds. She'll know safety but not ignorance. She'll have choices we never had. That's what matters." The park was quiet around us, just the sound of wind moving through bare branches and the distant city sounds that Boston carried in its background constant. I thought about the woman I'd been when I'd first discovered I was pregnant, so certain that isolation was the solution, that I could build something separate from Alessandro's reality, that love meant leaving. I'd been wrong about all of it, not wrong about wanting to protect Lucia, but wrong about the method. Not wrong about understanding Alessandro's world was dangerous, but wrong about thinking that danger was eliminated through absence rather than managed through engagement. "I'm glad I met you," I said to Alessandro. "I'm glad she exists. I'm glad we're doing this together." He kissed my forehead, and for a moment, we stood in the park where our story had begun, not as lovers rediscovering each other, but as parents committed to the welfare of the small life we'd created together. The roses on the bench were a marker of that journey. The pain and separation and desperate searching, all transformed into this moment of emergence, into something that felt like could almost be called peace. Behind us, Lucia slept through it all, unaware of the weight of history and choice and consequence that surrounded her arrival. She existed in a world that both of us had built through struggle and sacrifice, and the difficult work of learning to negotiate between impossible positions. She existed as proof that love could survive organized crime and betrayal and desperate fear. She existed as the reason why two people who had every logical reason to remain separated had instead chosen to remain together. And that, I finally understood, was the only redemption either of us was ever going to require.